Alright guys, hey, what's up and welcome back to the channel. I've got another end of the year video for you guys today. We're going to do books today. Books is something that I haven't really done much of in this channel. I don't know that I've actually done anything that I've ended up publishing at this point. But I want to go ahead and get into that. I'm really sorry last month I got really focused on movies. It was just a crazy month for movies. There were like 15 movies coming out over the course of like 5 days. At one point it was a lot to cover. And now that December's over, I think I've got some more time to kind of expand into some of these other things like books and theater and video games and things like that. Anyway, like I said, it's the end of the year, and today I thought we'd go through every single book that I read and try to rank them from worst to best. And I didn't read as much as I would have liked to, as much as I planned to. Through the last like 6 months of 2021, or 2022, sorry, I had read, I think 31 or 32 books just from like July through December. And I knew that I probably wouldn't, just based on previous reading behavior, I probably wouldn't keep that up. So I tried to go for like 35 for 2023 in total. And I only got to like 23. But anyways, let's go ahead and get started here. Number 23 is S. This is something I was really excited for because I had recently read House of Leaves, and I just liked the like uniqueness of that. And I was trying to find some other like unique books, and this was definitely something that was probably even further out than House of Leaves. I think the concept is by J.J. Abrams. It's written by somebody else, and it's this book that is, the book itself says Ship of Theseus, and it's by I don't remember who the like fake author is. And then you open it, and it's like a real book, like it has all the writing of the book, but then it has these like pen, like people making markings and like writing letters to each other back and forth. And they have like these drawings that they've drawn, and so you're reading the book, but you're also reading what they're saying to each other. And then it also has these like pamphlets and like posters and things that they've like slid in between some of the pages to like give to each other. And you're kind of reading this whole history of like everything that's happened both in the book and what's going on kind of outside of the book between these two people who are writing to each other. And it just did not work for me. I didn't think it was ever interesting. And I thought when it thought it was getting interesting, it was actually just getting really lame and cheesy. It turns into this weird like conspiracy thing that I just didn't like. I couldn't wait for it to be over. Just the actual like book itself, I thought was like okay. Like there wasn't that much happening, and it's just crazy because the whole thing is about how this author is, you know, one of the greatest, like most renowned authors of all time, but he had a secret private life. And the book is just fine. It's not super like elegant in any way, and it's honestly kind of bad at points. And then especially just the actual, you know, the notes that are being made to each other was just a real low light for me. There wasn't much to like about this book at all outside of the really unique concept. And just above that at number 22 is a book that I know a lot of people love a lot. It just didn't work for me, and I honestly don't even have that much to say about it. But it's This Is How You Lose the Time War. It's just kind of a series of letters that are being written from one person to another. It's like in the far future, and they're like on two opposite sides of these factions who are kind of eternally warring. And they're these two like agents they're trying to basically like skip to different parts in time and like change the course of history to like do these other things. And once that happens, the other person can jump and like make these other changes. And so it's kind of like this friendship develops between these two people who should hate each other. And it's told mostly in the forms of letters with like a few blurbs kind of preceding each letter. I just didn't feel like anything happened. And I also felt like all of the letters just eventually turned into like 7-page descriptions of like how much they like loved and missed each other. And I didn't find that like interesting. I thought it was really repetitive. Like it was kind of cool at first, and then I was just kind of like, all these letters are essentially the same thing. And I will say it's very well written. Like the prose that they're using in these letters, incredible. But not something I had a lot of fun reading at all. And at number 21 is Dark Matter, and this is something I was really excited for because people seem to really love Blake Crouch. I never read him before, and I knew this was one of his bigger, more recent releases. And I read this quickly, so it at least was like a page turner. I just felt like the whole concept of itself was collapsing in on itself, where like it had logic that was just directly breaking rules that it had. I thought that what was actually happening was kind of like campy and cheesy. I thought the ending was really bad. But yeah, it's a sci-fi thriller about this guy who like loves his family but is feeling really down on his luck. Like he like missed out on these big opportunities in his life, and he ends up being like kidnapped one day and like sent to another dimension, and it's this like alternate reality, like multiverse kind of thriller, where he's like trying to get back to his family and seeing all of these different like dimensions or realities and how things would have turned out in different ways. I just felt like it was very, very like surface level. I didn't think there was anything too deep here. And like I said, they introduce rules that then just get broken or don't make sense. And the ending I thought was like actively bad. And at number 20 is a book that I know a lot of other people love too, much like, you know, the previous two. But it's just something that like I thought worked at times and other times was just sacrificing any kind of narrative or character work just to have like some cutesy prose, and even the cutesy prose I thought was like pretty shallow. And that's Under the Whispering Door. I have not read any of this author's other work. This is my first thing. And I liked the idea of it a lot, which is why I bought it. I think there's something really interesting in like exploring death and like what happens after death. And this kind of like inn where you die and you go to like accept your death. I thought sounded really great. But like I said, they sacrifice so much of the actual meaning of what's going on to just have like cutesy scenes that are just like, look how like cute and like an endearing this like world and these characters are. And it just like, there gets to a point where I think I was probably not even halfway through this book and I was just ready for them to like move on to the next thing because they were just kind of hanging out. And yeah, I don't know. I didn't hate this. I just felt like it was trying so hard to be like quirky that it was like distracting itself from what actually mattered about the book. And at number 19, it's kind of a classic. I hope I'm not like putting people off by putting so many books that people love this low on the list, because I mean at this point I think even the last few are still books that I gave 3 stars. I just didn't like as much as some of the others. But that's Black Hole, and I know this is on a lot of lists of like the greatest graphic novels of all time. And just like even outside of graphic novels, just like classic kind of literature. And I liked this. I liked some of the things that this book was trying to say. And maybe I'm in the minority here, I just didn't love the art style. I know a lot of people have called this like super influential and you know, one of the greatest art styles like in any graphic novel. I didn't love the art style, but it was just one of those books where I felt like it was just really on the nose, and I thought the characters were all pretty like one note. You spend a lot of time with a lot of them, but you still don't really understand a lot of them by the end of it. And like, I did like, which is why it's so high in here, I liked the like kind of non-linear structure, where you're just kind of like lost in time at some points and you start kind of piecing it all together. I did like that. I just felt like on the whole, it was not as immediately deep as I wanted it to be, and maybe on a reread I'll like discover, you know, other things that I missed. I just felt like at least the first time through, I just wasn't super impressed. I wasn't super interested in the characters or what was happening outside of a few scenes. I just felt like it was like a fine enough thing, like an easy read, that was kind of unlike a lot of other things that I've read, but nothing that like stood out all that much to me at all. And at number 18 is Raised in Captivity by Chuck Klosterman. I read a lot of Chuck Klosterman this year, so get ready for that. Which is funny because I also don't think I rated any of his books above a 3-star. But I'll give you some background here on what happened because I think it's important to how I felt about this book. The first book I read of his was The Visible Man. And I thought that it was like good. It was like good enough. And I was like, man, I wish this guy wrote like nonfiction, because I really like some of his just like thoughts that are just like kind of ponderings on human nature. And then I found out that's mostly what he does is nonfiction. So I read a lot of his nonfiction, and we'll get into some of that later. This is Raised in Captivity, which is one of his other, he has a few other fiction works other than The Visible Man. This is like micro short stories. They're all like, I want to say 5 to 10 pages at the longest. And a couple of these are really, really, really good. And then most of them, because they're so short and just don't have any time to develop, are just so forgettable. Like, even if there's a good concept there, it just is either like a rushed ending or a bad ending or like an unearned ending. And then some of the ones I just also didn't like. I like Chuck Klosterman's nonfiction a lot more than I seem to like his fiction. It was easy to read because the stories are so short that you can really just pick it up for 1 second, read a chapter, and put it right back down. But it was just also something that, even though it was so short and so easy to read, I kind of just couldn't wait to be done with it because there was just such a large number of stories that I felt like didn't mean much to me outside of the handful that I did really, really like. And at number 17, another Chuck Klosterman book, this is I Wear the Black Hat. And I think part of my problem with this might have been that I listened to the audiobook, and I'm just not an audiobook person. I have like ADHD, and even when I'm taking Adderall, I just like, I put on an audiobook and I start to zone out, and I like, 3 seconds into it, I'm already like thinking about something else, and I think back and I'm like, how much time has even passed? Because I haven't been listening to anything. And I think part of that was my problem with this, but I also think part of it not, because the more Chuck Klosterman that I've read, the more I like just disagree with. I really like his like insights into things, but his actual like personal views I usually don't agree with that much. And I feel like this one had a lot of kind of like weird personal views where I was just like, I think you're like wrong here. But this was like an interesting look at like villains throughout like humanity and film and what it means to be a villain and why people are villains and why villains have such a big impact on us, which is an interesting concept. And if you like Chuck Klosterman or you think you'd like that concept, maybe this would be worth a read. But compared to some of the other ones that I read, there just wasn't as much here that I liked as much as some of the other stuff that I've read of his this year. At number 16, I reread The Bad Beginning. That's the first book in the Series of Unfortunate Events series. I bought the whole like big box collection from like a Barnes & Noble earlier this year, and that's the only one that I've read so far. I read them all as a kid and then just thought it would be fun to reread them. And these still are like really, really fun and really quick. I probably read this whole first book in like an hour. It is just like exactly what you remember it being, and it's this like weirdly smart and witty writing style for a book that is, I would say middle grade to maybe the tiniest bit lower. But I had a lot of fun reading this, and it's not higher because it is like children's literature essentially, but it's just really well done, and I loved this so much as a kid. It was just fun to like reread it and see, Count Olaf and Violet and Klaus and Sunny and all of the other characters that like I grew up loving. And I watched the Netflix series a couple years ago, and so it's just fun going back to that just because I like that like world and that like weirdly dark, like witty kind of style so much. And number 15 is Bunny. This was one of the really polarizing books this year. I feel like most people loved it, but a lot of people didn't, and I can tell why they didn't. And it's this weird like Heathers meets like a weird like A24 horror movie kind of vibe essentially, where this girl is like an outcast and she ends up being taken in as friends by this group of the popular girls at her like college who they call themselves bunnies. And this girl is just like, she's going through like a lot, and just like weird stuff starts happening. I don't want to go any further into it than that, just because I think you should kind of go into this book as blind as possible. But I would definitely think of it like that. Think of it as like Heathers meets like a really highbrow like art house horror film. And I liked parts of it. I think like, especially towards the beginning, I was like really into it. I think it just takes a path that I didn't love. And I still liked the book for the most part. There just gets to be a part where I felt like it was just so far gone that I was just not really as invested, and the stuff that I wanted to see I wasn't seeing. And so yeah, for that reason it's down here, but it's still a decent pickup, and it was one of the more popular books this year. So yeah, if you haven't read it, I'd be surprised if you don't at least like own it or plan to read it, because that's what everybody was talking about this year, I feel like. And at number 14 is My Best Friend's Exorcism. This is like the first Grady Hendrix book that I've ever read. And I didn't love it. I do also have How to Sell a Haunted House, so I'll probably read that eventually. But this one in particular, like, it was going for like an 80s like B horror movie vibe, but it just forgets to do the horror, like the B horror part of it so much that it's really more of almost like a coming of age story where like just weird stuff happens sometimes. It's never really horror at all, I would say, or even like B-movie, like camp horror. And I just didn't think that coming of age story was that interesting, and they were like hinting at bigger things, and it's just never really fully explored. I felt like this was like a pretty poorly written book for the most part. But what saves it here is that in the last, I don't know, 2 chapters or so maybe, you see what he was building towards and what he wanted, and you can almost like, I almost felt like he had this idea for this ending and then wrote the book accordingly, because the rest of the book really does not fall in line with what these last 2 chapters are, what they mean. But it's just like this really like out of nowhere, like moving story about like friendship and life, and just like what it means to have friends and what it means to be a friend. I just like, I was like almost crying because I thought that part just kind of came out of nowhere and was so good. And so for that reason, I moved it about things like Bunny. But I just felt like for the most part, it was like a mediocre-ish book that had a really, really, really like absurdly strong ending. And at number 13 is The 7.5 Lives of Evelyn Hardcastle. Not to be confused with The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which I have already read previously in a different year. But anyway, this one is not like a, golden age Hollywood romance novel. This is like a gothic murder mystery thriller with some weird twists that I just didn't love. I liked the idea. So basically the concept here is that someone wakes up and they have no memory of who they are, why they're where they are even. And they wake up and they basically find out that someone is being murdered, and they have to figure out who caused the murder, like who the murderer is. And if they don't, then the next day it's going to restart and they're going to wake up as somebody else. And they're going to be able to like see all that is events from that person's point of view. And they have 8 lives to do it. After 8 lives, they forget everything they know and they restart again. And that'll just keep going on for forever. And so I thought that this sounded, in my mind, it was a book that was kind of like each chapter was a different person's perspective, and by the end you figured out what it was. But it's literally, it's one person jumping around to all of these different characters, which I didn't find as interesting, and I kind of would have preferred it to be the other way. And then also with the fact that it is the one person, they have to find a reason for that at the end, and the reason I thought was just so dumb and stupid and not even the right genre, that I just like really, really didn't care anymore. And so this book is like a cool like gothic atmosphere, but I think that its actual concept is just like holding it back. Like the characters that you're like you're kind of jumping from day to day, they usually don't see each other or interact outside of a few like really rare occasions. So it doesn't really feel like cohesive. It just feels like all these different stories that you're kind of making up on the fly so that things don't have to like make sense when they intersect. And it just like the whole like starting over again thing was getting really, really repetitive to me. I was just like getting really ready to be done with this book, honestly. And I think it's well written. I want to be clear about that. And I do think that this was like a feat to try to pull off. I just don't think it actually came together in a very like entertaining way. Like when you have like a murder mystery thriller kind of thing, it really needs to be like a page turner. And I just didn't feel that way about this. Like I was kind of always ready to put down the book. At number 12, we're going back to Chuck Klosterman. This is Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs, which is, I would say, probably his like most famous book. It's definitely the book that got him, as popular as he is now. And it's just like a look back at like pop culture, essentially, just like all these different forms of pop culture and just him writing these kind of different essays on them. And this is just another one where I liked this a lot more than some of the other ones. But it kind of has 2 problems going for it. One, some of the essays are way stronger than the others. Most of them are at least generally good. There are a few that I didn't love. And I think part of that is because since this is like a collection of pop culture essays, this book is, I think it was published in 2003. A lot of these references are 20 years old. There's a whole chapter about, I think it's like the first season of The Real World. I don't watch The Real World. I don't know anyone that watches The Real World. I think it's still around, but I definitely don't know anybody that ever watched the first season. So just like making all these comparisons is like interesting and cool. And I think I actually did like that chapter specifically, so maybe that's a bad example. But there are just things like that he's like making references to these pop culture things that are just no longer relevant, or that I'm just like totally unaware of. On top of there being a few essays that I just didn't think they were strong and just didn't agree with what his point was. I think it's also worth pointing out that this book is definitely like a product of its time, and there are some weird, I'll call them like jokes or like thoughts here that I don't think would ever be published in 2023. And number 11 is Candy House. This is a sequel to Visit from the Goon Squad. This is Jennifer Egan's follow up to that. And I did like this one. I don't think I liked it as much as A Visit from the Goon Squad. But it's almost like if you take some of the characters from A Visit from the Goon Squad, see what they're up to like way after that, and then put like a kind of sci-fi overlay on it, is kind of what you get here. And so if you liked A Visit from the Goon Squad and you want to see what some of those characters are up to like in their later years, you'll like this one. The sci-fi thing doesn't fit in too much. It does influence a lot of the world and kind of a lot of what it's trying to say, but it doesn't like totally make it feel like it changed the genre or anything. Like it definitely feels like a true follow-up to A Visit from the Goon Squad. And number 10 is What Moves the Dead. And this is like a retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, just obviously rewritten by someone else. And it is like really, really strong. And I'm not like intimately familiar with this story. Like I have seen the Vincent Price movie, and I've seen the Netflix series, which obviously like did its own kind of retelling. But this is a more truthful retelling than the Netflix series. And it's just like, it makes some like small changes for the most part. The end is where things start to be a little bit more. But I think everything it did really just like enhanced the original story as far as I'm aware of it. I thought it was just like this really awesome, like I like kind of gothic stuff, and obviously this is one of the more gothic things you can read, or maybe not one of the more gothic, like I guess you could read like Dracula or something, which I'm a big fan of, but it was one of the more gothic things that I read this year, at least, let's say that. And I just like really liked this like tone and this atmosphere and just this like setting. And even though it is kind of a book where like not that much happens, it's just kind of them in this house like having conversations, and then like towards the end some stuff starts happening. It's so short, and I was just so caught up in everything that was happening, it was just, one of those things where you're not really ready for it to be over. And the author is turning this into a series now. I think there's going to be a second book, and it's going to be a take on a different story. I don't know how much I love that idea. I know this was supposed to be a standalone, I think. It has now been turned into a series with that book coming out, I think, this year, 2024. We'll see how that goes, but this first book I did really like a lot. And number 9 is The Silent Patient. This is one of the bigger like thrillers of the last few years, and it's also Alex Michaelides' first book, which is kind of impressive. And I was really drawn to this concept about this woman who was found with her husband tied up and murdered, and she's just standing there. And when she's arrested, she never speaks again. And so ends up being sent to this like mental asylum. And it's like, I want to say it's maybe like 10 years later or something. And you're following this psychiatrist who's kind of like really into the case and wants to work with her. And so he starts working at this institution. And I think that I thought it would be this really cool like look at like trying to like interrogate this woman who's not speaking, which maybe wouldn't be the most interesting thing, which is why I think some changes were made. And those changes were that this psychiatrist really acts as more of a detective than a psychiatrist. I think he only actually like has like 2, maybe 3 interviews with her throughout the book, and most of them are really, really short. For the most part, he's doing things that psychiatrists wouldn't do. Like he's like tracking down like leads and like interrogating people and like doing all kinds of like investigative work. And the book is pointing out that like that's not normal and he shouldn't be doing that. But it does turn it into more of a detective story, I think, than like a psychological like exploration kind of thing. Which is fine because I could not put this book down. I don't read like a ton of thrillers, but this is just one that like I just had to know what happened next. And I really liked everything that happened in it. Like I'm somebody that like, I like when like there's kind of a tell on the, like before they give the twist, there's like a tell like half a page up. Because it just makes me feel smart that I figured out the twist, even though I really didn't. But I thought the twist worked really well. I liked everything kind of after that. I think though, if I had a critique of this book, it would be that in between this kind of psychiatrist story, it's interspersed with like journal entries from the woman who's it's like from before her life and leading up to the murder. And I think that's one of the bigger problems with this book, because these journal entries are not really journal entries. They're not even formatted like journal entries. They just say that they're journal entries. But most of them are like 99% dialogue, which is not how people write in journal entries. You don't just write a conversation word for word, but that's what's happening. And it really just turns into an excuse to have like information dumps, and then to have it tie into the end, which was the part of the ending that I thought was shaky because it didn't really make a lot of sense. And I don't want to say anything about that because I don't want to like give anything away. There is one scene from a movie that I'm thinking of that would be very relevant, and that is Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is probably not what somebody was expecting me to say, unless you've both seen that and read this book, because there's a part of the ending that I was just like, this is a little like a bit much. But other than that, I really liked this. I thought this was a really strong first book. I would definitely read his second one. It was just something that like I could not put down. Number 8 is The Flick. This is not a novel. This is the book of a play, but I am counting it because it's on GoodReads, and so I feel like that counts. This is written by Annie Baker, and it won the Pulitzer Prize in like 2014 off Broadway. I think it was at Playwrights Horizons. But it's just like the concept of it seems so interesting to me, and I'm not somebody that reads the books of plays. But it's like a play that is not very often produced, and even though I live in New York, I probably would have to wait for forever for someone to feel like doing a production of it. So I read this, and I really liked it a lot. It's the story of these 3 employees that work at this theater, this kind of like rundown theater, but it's the last theater in their town, or I think even in their like county, that still does film projection. And it's just kind of this like story of like all these people at different points in their lives, and also like how the entertainment industry is changing, and like trying to hold on to like the purest forms of art. And there's not anything like super over dramatic or crazy that happens in this. It's a really like slice of life story. I just love movie theaters so much. I love theater, and this was like a super quick read. And yeah, I would love to see this performed like on a stage. And at number 7, this is one of the biggest TikTok books I feel like in existence, probably the biggest one. That's The Song of Achilles. I wasn't sure if this would live up to all of the hype, but I think it definitely did. I was really, really into this. It's like a retelling of the story of Achilles from the perspective of Patroclus. And it's this also like love story between them, and just kind of like goes into all of Patroclus's like his background and how he ended up being able to meet Achilles, how him and Achilles got so close, how close were they, and like everything that leads up to like the death of Patroclus that leads Achilles to go on his kind of like rampage essentially. And obviously those are all spoilers, but it's the story of Achilles, so it's like thousands of years old. I don't feel as bad about that. But I just don't see any reason, and I don't want this to sound like very like, you know, super like 21st century of me, but I can't imagine ever wanting to like read or see another version of this story, because this one was just so good. Like even just like watching Troy, I would just rather like reread this book, because I feel like it just like has a lot more to it, like as far as the characters go and a lot of the things that are going on, is just like really, really strong, especially for a book that is famous for blowing up on TikTok. Not that it's a bad thing to blow up on TikTok, but a lot of those books are kind of like romance or like romance thrillers or kind of things like that kind of come and go. This one actually does, I think, have a lot of actual like artistic merit to it. And at number 6, this is the last Chuck Klosterman book on this list. And that's But What If We're Wrong? Thinking About the Present as If It Were the Past, I think is the full title. And I actually, believe it or not, have more Chuck Klosterman books behind me that I just haven't gotten around to reading. But this is the best of any of them that I've read so far, I think. it's this like, and I don't want this to sound like conspiratorial, because it's definitely not. And there's like a whole chapter about how it's not encouraging conspiracy theories, but it's just this interesting look at like essentially there's no way. It's essentially like there's no way we can predict the future. Like we have to look at the past as if it were the present. And like that sounds confusing, but it's essentially like thinking about like he's talking to like a Columbia physicist, like a professor, and they're saying that like there have just been so many times over the course of the world that we think we understand things and it turns out we don't at all. And so it's things as simple as like gravity, and like we think we understand gravity, but there are also a lot of things about it we don't understand, and it's entirely possible that like 100 years from now we find out that gravity is actually like a symptom of another force that's like undiscovered at this point, and it's not actually its own standalone thing. It's caused by something else that we just don't have the capacity to understand at this point. And that's just really like interesting. And it's also talking about like for example, like trying to predict the next like famous author, like best author of the century, and like how you can't do that based on like what we know at this point or what we think would be popular at this point. You have to like look at the past. And he's talking about like Herman Melville and Moby Dick, and how that book was received super poorly, sold so poorly that Herman Melville like died in poverty, and nobody cared about it until like 70 years later, and now it's like one of the biggest American classics. And so he's basically using a lot of Herman Melville's situation to try to identify like why did it blow up, what made it blow up, what are the like qualities we should be looking for in actors now that would help us decide, do they meet that criteria that they will then be a voice that people are going to remember 100 years from now, and that probably will not be the people who are by far the biggest names right now. Like that just usually doesn't happen. And so yeah, it's just a lot of things like that, like changing the way that you look at things, and again, not in a conspiracy theory way, but just in like from a different viewpoint, I think. I just really liked a lot of the things that he had to say in this. It was one that I think was less like gag focused and more like a real through line through every single essay, and trying to like actually come to a conclusion on things. And I don't know, I just really, really like this one a lot. And I'm also realizing I'm wrong here. Earlier when I said I didn't give any of his books more than 3 stars, I gave this one 4 stars. So there's one book that I gave 4 stars. Number 5, Daisy Jones and the Six. I read this really early this year. I don't even remember if I knew that the show was coming out at that point, but I had read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo the year previously. I loved that book. So I checked out this one, and I think Taylor Jenkins-Reid is just like one of my favorite authors. Like just like her ability to completely encapsulate like an era and like a world, but not like a fantasy world obviously, but just like a real world, like Golden Age Hollywood, like the 70s rock scene, and just I don't want to get ahead of myself, but just things like that. I've never seen anything like it, where you're just totally transported to these other times and these scenes, and it's just so good. And this one it's like an interesting book. Maybe some people won't like it for this, but it's told in like completely dialogue format because it's supposed to be like it's a documentary, and so you're jumping from all of these like lines of dialogue that are being intercut together from these different characters. And because that reason, it's a really short book. You can finish it in probably a day, 2 days at most. And I probably did. But it's just like, you feel so wrapped up in this world of like 70s rock and roll. I guess I've just like never read an author who can just immediately like take me to these different times that I don't even necessarily, I'm not like the biggest fan of Golden Age Hollywood or 70s rock, but after reading those books, I definitely was. And yeah, I don't know, I really like this book a lot. I think you should definitely give it a shot, especially with how quick you can read it. One of my favorites of this year. Number 4, we're coming up on the end here, but that is Royal Assassin, and that's number 2 in the Farseer trilogy, part of the Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. And I did really, really like this book, which is why it's number 4. I thought that it dragged at points in terms of the pacing. I know sometimes people say that about Robin Hobb because it's so character focused instead of plot focused, but I don't even think that was it, because I didn't feel that at all in the first book. I thought that it dragged a little bit. But I just really loved the ending. It wasn't as easy to get through as the first book was for me, but there's really like, outside of like a few pacing problems for me, there was really like nothing else wrong with this book. It was just the perfect continuation to a book that I already loved. Number 3, we're gonna come back to Taylor Jenkins-Reid. That's Malibu Rising. This is one that I didn't think at all that I would like more than Daisy Jones, but I definitely did. And it's there's a singer, kind of briefly mentioned. He's one of the husbands in the 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and this is about his children. And it's like a Southern California, like 70s, like beach tale essentially. And this is one where it wasn't even necessarily that she's like transporting me to a totally different world. Like it is like kind of a period thing, and it's like Hollywood and famous people. But it was more that it was this really like touching family tale that like I started like crying toward the end at some of the scenes, because there are just these conversations that are being had that I'm not even like a super big like family story person, but this just like really hit me the way some of these people were feeling. And you know, the end was so strong, and I really liked everything before that too. And it's like kind of jumping back and forth between these children as adults and these children as they're growing up, like as kids, with like an absent, like famous father. And it all just comes together so well. I still think I liked Evelyn Hugo more, but this is, I think, Taylor Jenkins-Reid's second best book, I would say. I haven't read Carrie Soto yet, but I liked this one so much more than I imagined that I would. Number 2 is Assassin's Apprentice. This is the first book in the Farseer trilogy. And I already kind of mentioned it earlier, but I thought this was the perfect fantasy book, where we're seeing essentially this bastard child who is being raised in this castle and like being trained to be an assassin and like serve his king. And there's like all this like world stuff going on. And it's just like, I think this one maybe moved faster because we do see him from the time he's, I don't know, 5 or 6 until he's 16, 17, I want to say. So it's just kind of time is flying by faster. But this was the perfect fantasy book to me. All of the characters are so great. The world is so interesting. Even like there aren't too many like kind of action scenes, but the ones that are there are incredible. I think the like magic is super like unique and like interesting. It's not how you would think it would be. I'm currently reading the 3rd book, and I'm maybe a third of the way through. So I'll probably put up a review of that whenever I finish it. But yeah, Assassin's Apprentice, my number 2 book of the year. Just so good, I can't recommend it enough. But at number 1 is My Annihilation. And this is something that if you don't like dark books, I don't think you would like this at all, because it is just so incredibly, overwhelmingly dark and dreary and hopeless. But I kind of think that vibe is fun, and just like, I was like reading this and I just like, there were so many times where I realized that I'd never read anything like this. And so I went and I bought a lot more of this author's books. But yeah, this is like this weird story of this guy who goes to this cabin, you don't really know why, and he finds this manuscript, and he starts reading it, and it's just this like story, this really dark story of somebody's life. And then it starts like with like reading more of the manuscript and like what's happening at the cabin. And I don't even want to go into the details of it because I don't want to spoil anything. And also I probably can't go into a lot of it without, flagging it on YouTube. But it was mind-blowing to me, just like the things that were happening. And like I was reading it and I was trying to like explain to my girlfriend what was happening, and it was just like she was like so like confused, and I was just like, it only gets weirder from here. But yeah, I just like, this was unlike anything I've ever read, like I said, and just so good, and I can't wait to read more of this author's work. Okay guys, so that's every book I read this year. rank from worst to best. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? I'd love to know. I know I had some kind of like beloved books towards the bottom of that list, but they just didn't work for me. And I only read 23 books. There wasn't even that much room for like actual bad books. They're just bad comparatively, I guess. But yeah, let me know what you think. Is there anything that I left out that I should be, that you think I should read? I'd love to know. I'm trying to always like add more things to my TBR. And I'll probably do a TBR video soon, just for books that I would really like to finish this year. I don't think I'll do monthly ones, but just for the year. But yeah, if you like this video and you want to see more content like this, don't forget to like and subscribe.